In December 1979, the Soviet Union launched what seemed like a swift, calculated move, a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan. Their goal was simple on paper: to support a crumbling communist regime, secure their southern flank, and maintain control over a neighbor tilting dangerously toward rebellion. What Moscow didn't realize was that it had just stepped into the graveyard of empires, a place where mighty powers throughout history had come to die. From the British to the Mongols, Afghanistan had resisted every foreign hand that tried to hold it down. The Soviets, with one of the most powerful militaries on Earth, thought they would be different. But what followed was nearly a decade of brutal warfare, political fallout, and a slow, painful realization that they had entered a conflict they could never win. This wasn't just a war. It was the beginning of the end for one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. One of the most critical reasons the Soviet Union failed in Afghanistan was its complete underestimation of Afghan resistance, not just militarily, but culturally and ideologically. When Soviet troops rolled into Kabul, the Kremlin believed that they were entering a politically fragile nation that could be propped up with force and communist ideology. What they didn't understand was that Afghanistan was not like Eastern Europe or Central Asia. It was a deeply tribal society with fierce local loyalties and a centuries-old tradition of resisting foreign intervention. To the Soviets, the Afghan people were supposed to see them as liberators, protectors of a progressive communist regime. But to the Afghan Mujahideen, tribal elders, and ordinary civilians, they were nothing more than invaders, repeating the mistakes of the British, Raj and Alexander the Great before them. The Soviets failed to grasp the symbolic power of jihad in Afghan culture. The moment Soviet tanks entered Afghan soil, the conflict took on a religious and existential dimension. This wasn't just about politics, it was about faith, honor, and ancestral memory. Afghan fighters, armed with outdated rifles and homemade explosives, began to bleed the Red Army dry. It's not through large-scale battles, but through ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and sabotage. It was asymmetric warfare at its most effective. The Soviets were not trained, nor psychologically prepared, to fight a war where the enemy disappeared into mountains, struck at night, and melted back into civilian populations. On paper, the Soviet Union had everything: air power, mechanized divisions, logistical superiority, and a brutal intelligence network. But they lacked the one thing Afghanistan required: local legitimacy. The more they bombed villages, the more civilians turned against them. The more they propped up puppet leaders like Babrik Karmal, the more Afghan nationalism turned into religious resistance. In fact, many Afghans who were neutral at the beginning of the conflict gradually became fighters as they witnessed Soviet brutality up close. Homes destroyed, families displaced, mosques bombed. This created an emotional fire that no amount of military force could extinguish. The Soviet leadership never anticipated how deeply rooted Afghan resistance would become. Their intelligence agencies had reported instability, factional infighting, and tribal divisions, but failed to see that these very divisions would unite in the face of a common foreign enemy. The Mujahideen were not a single unified army. They were fragmented, often competing groups. The presence of Soviet troops gave them a shared purpose. The USSR, without realizing it, gave life to a national resistance movement that had previously never existed on this scale. Once that resistance ignited, it became impossible to extinguish. Another devastating reason for the Soviet Union's failure in Afghanistan was the sheer complexity of the terrain, both literal and political. The geography of Afghanistan has defeated invaders for centuries, but the Soviets believed their tanks, helicopters, and firepower would overcome mountains, caves, and deserts. What they failed to understand was that the land itself was a weapon, and it didn't belong to them. From the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush to the narrow winding valleys of Nurostan, Afghanistan was not a battlefield that could be controlled through conventional tactics. It was a maze, and the Mujahideen knew every turn. Soviet forces were trained for open warfare. urban suppression, and mechanized assaults. But Afghanistan didn't play by those rules. The enemy didn't stand and fight in set-piece battles. They vanished into the mountains, reappearing miles away to strike where the Soviets were weakest. Convoys were ambushed in narrow passes. Helicopters were shot down by fighters who knew exactly where to hide. Soldiers froze in the mountain winters and suffocated in the summer heat, often with little understanding of where they were, or who they were even fighting. The rugged landscape didn't just slow them down, it demoralized them, isolated them, exposed every weakness in their planning. But the terrain wasn't just physical, it was political too. The Soviets had no real understanding of the internal dynamics of Afghan society. Tribes, clans, ethnic groups, religious schools, and centuries of grudges shaped the loyalty map of Afghanistan. The Soviets entered expecting to fight a centralized war, but found themselves in a fragmented theater with no clear front lines and no clear enemies. The man who shook your hand in the morning could be planting a mine for your vehicle that night. Even among the Mujahideen, alliances shifted rapidly. Some groups fought the Soviets one day and made local truces the next. The Soviets couldn't keep up. They tried to install puppet leaders, bribe tribal heads, and crush dissent, but for every village they pacified, 5 more turned against them. This political chaos made long-term strategy impossible. The Soviet commanders in the field found themselves in a constant state of confusion. Intelligence was often outdated or simply wrong. Many officers didn't even understand the local languages or customs, making negotiation and infiltration nearly impossible. Attempts to build trust with locals failed miserably. Their aid efforts were seen as propaganda. Their local partners were viewed as traitors. Now, the very ground they walked on, both literally and diplomatically, rejected them. Ultimately, the Soviets learned too late that Afghanistan could not be bent to fit a foreign design. You couldn't draw maps on this land and expect loyalty to follow. The mountains did not care about ideology, and the valleys could not be conquered by brute force. The geography was not just hard, it was alive with memory, resistance, and unshakable pride, and it devoured every arrogant step the Red Army took. Perhaps one of the most strategically crippling reasons for the Soviet failure in Afghanistan was the covert but colossal involvement of the United States and its allies. The moment Soviet tanks rolled into Kabul, Washington saw an opportunity, not just to challenge the USSR's expansionism, but to bleed it from the inside, the same way America had bled in Vietnam. The result was Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. Billions of dollars flowed into Pakistan, where they were funneled to Afghan Mujahideen groups. Weapons, training, and intelligence were handed over not to build a peaceful Afghanistan, but to make it a nightmare for Moscow. Stinger missiles arrived, shoulder-fired, and deadly accurate, a game-changer. Soviet helicopters, once the pride of their air superiority, began falling from the sky like birds with broken wings. The balance of power on the ground shifted. The Mujahideen, who had once hidden in caves, now hunted the hunters. Every time, the Soviets adjusted their tactics. The Americans raised the stakes. Supplies increased. Tactics were refined. Even propaganda was weaponized, painting the Soviet invaders as godless communists fighting against a noble Islamic resistance. This wasn't just war, it was theater, and the whole world was watching. But it wasn't just the United States. Countries like Saudi Arabia and China also played roles. The Saudis matched American funding dollar for dollar, turning the war into a religious crusade. Fighters from across the Muslim world poured into Afghanistan, radicalized by ideology and funded by foreign sponsors. The conflict mutated into something bigger than just an occupation. It became a battlefield for global influence, a proxy war. Between East and West, communism and capitalism, atheism and belief. The Soviets, who entered to protect a neighboring government, were suddenly at the center of a holy war. What made this worse for Moscow was that they couldn't counter it in the same way. Their attempts at psychological operations were clumsy and outdated. Their allies in the Afghan government were seen as illegitimate, and worst of all, Their own people were beginning to question why their sons were dying in a country that most of them couldn't even find on a map. The Soviet propaganda machine could not hide the coffins, the wounded veterans, the mental scars, or the economic costs that kept piling up with every passing month. The war became a drain not only on Soviet blood, but on Soviet confidence. The global spotlight was against them. The moral high ground, whether real or manufactured, belonged to their enemies. Back home, that mattered more than anyone in the Politburo had predicted. While the Soviets fought in the mountains, the West quietly planted seeds in the minds of millions. This was not a superpower. This was an empire in decline, trapped in a war it could neither win nor justify. As the war dragged on, the Soviet Union began to feel the crushing weight of an economic burden it could no longer carry. The war in Afghanistan was not just fought on mountains and in villages, it was fought in factories, oil pipelines, currency, markets, and in the struggling homes of Soviet citizens. Every bullet fired, every helicopter lost, every soldier wounded, all of it drained. Precious resources from an economy that was already buckling under decades of inefficiency and isolation. The early 1980s, the Soviet economic system was under immense pressure. Central planning had led to stagnation, shortages, and black markets. Productivity was falling. Technological innovation lagged behind the West. And oil, the lifeline of Soviet export revenue, saw price fluctuations that sent shockwaves through the already fragile system. Into this environment came the Afghan War, demanding billions of rubles every year. Military equipment had to be manufactured and replaced. Troops had to be paid, fed, transported, and medically treated. Logistics lines had to be secured across thousands of kilometers. And unlike a short campaign with clear victory, this war offered no end, no spoils, no reward, just an endless cycle of attrition. What made it worse was that the Soviet leadership refused to acknowledge the full scale of the economic disaster unfolding. Official reports downplayed casualties and costs, but the truth leaked out through returning soldiers, grieving families, and whispers within the Communist Party itself. The morale of the Soviet workforce began to erode. Citizens began to question why bread was harder to find, while their government funneled money into a distant war that seemed to bring nothing but death and failure. Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985, recognized the crisis but was trapped. His reforms, perestroika and glasnost, aimed to revitalize the Soviet system, but the war was eating away at both his credibility and his ability to act decisively. Every ruble spent on Afghanistan was a ruble not spent on domestic reform. Every month the war continued, the Soviet people lost more faith in their leaders. The pressure wasn't just financial, it was psychological. The superpower was bleeding slowly, quietly, and hopelessly. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union had run out of illusions. It could no longer afford the war, but leaving meant admitting failure. Staying meant collapse. Either way, the empire was unraveling, and Afghanistan had become both the symptom and the symbol of that decline. The war, which was supposed to be a quick intervention, had exposed the structural rot inside one of the world's most powerful regimes, and it was only a matter of time before that rot reached the foundation. The final, and perhaps most fatal reason for the Soviet Union's failure in Afghanistan was the collapse of its own ideology. The very foundation on which it had built its identity as a superpower. The Soviet Union didn't just send soldiers into Afghanistan. It sent Marxist-Leninist theory, communist symbolism, and a vision of social revolution. The invasion was framed internally as a noble cause, protecting a socialist ally from imperialist threats. But on Afghan soil, that ideology found no takers. And as the war dragged on, it began to rot from within. Communism had always been sold as the future, a system that would free the working class, create equality, and stand against the exploitation of capitalism. But in Afghanistan, it revealed its limits. The rural, deeply religious Afghan population saw Soviet values not as liberating, but as alien and threatening. Land redistribution, women's education, secular governance, these reforms, while progressive on paper, were perceived by many locals as direct attacks on tradition, faith, and identity. The more the Soviets pushed their ideology, the more resistance hardened. Every ideological pamphlet dropped from a helicopter was met with a bullet from the ground, but the real collapse was not just in Afghanistan, it was back in Moscow. As the war became more brutal and less defensible, Soviet citizens began to see the cracks in the system they had been told was flawless. State-run media could no longer hide the casualties. Mothers of dead soldiers demanded answers. Young conscripts returned home broken physically and mentally and spoke of a war that had no meaning, no victory, and no honor. The ideological certainty that had powered the Soviet machine for decades began to erode under the weight of contradiction. How could a workers' paradise be bombing villages in the name of progress? How could a moral revolution create orphans and rubble? Even within the Communist Party, faith began to falter. Glasnost, the policy of openness, unleashed decades of suppressed doubt. Citizens began to ask forbidden questions. Intellectuals began to speak openly. And in this atmosphere of ideological awakening, the Afghan War stood as the most visible, most shameful evidence that the system had failed, not in theory, but in practice. It had tried to export revolution and ended up importing humiliation. The loss of ideological authority was the nail in the coffin. The Soviet Union didn't just lose soldiers or rubles in Afghanistan, it lost its narrative. It lost the moral justification for its existence. And once that happened, it was only a matter of time before the entire structure collapsed. In 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge, not as a victor, but as a survivor. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The red flag was lowered. In Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires had claimed yet another. The Soviet Union didn't lose in Afghanistan because it lacked weapons, numbers, or planning. It lost because it stepped into a war it didn't understand, against a people it couldn't control, in a land that had never been conquered for long. The failure wasn't immediate. It was slow, layered, and deeply systemic. But in hindsight, the reasons are painfully clear. First, they underestimated the Afghan people, not just as fighters, but as a culture that valued freedom, faith, and resistance over foreign-imposed ideology. Second, they were swallowed by a terrain that defied maps. It's broken by mountains and valleys that favored the patient, the hidden, and the local. Third, they faced a global opposition powered by the CIA, Saudi money, and Islamic volunteers, who turned the war into a holy cause with infinite fuel. Fourth, the war bled the Soviet economy dry, a system already crumbling from within, now suffocating under the weight of endless conflict. And finally, the heart of their defeat, the collapse of belief. Communism, once preached as the future, was exposed as an illusion, its promises broken on Afghan soil and buried under its ruins. Afghanistan didn't just defeat an army, it exposed an empire, pulled the mask off a superpower that had ruled half the world with iron and fear. And it did so not with overwhelming force, but with endurance, faith, and knowledge of its own ground. The Soviets entered thinking they were bringing order and left having brought chaos, both abroad and at home, in many ways. The war in Afghanistan became the mirror the Soviet Union couldn't avoid. In that reflection, it saw its own arrogance, its fragility, and its distance from the very people it claimed to uplift. The invasion that was meant to strengthen Soviet influence became the crack that shattered its global image, and ultimately, its existence. When the last Soviet tank crossed the Amu Darya River in 1989, the story should have ended. But it didn't. 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved. And to this day, analysts, historians, and generals look back and agree on one thing: the road to the Soviet collapse began in the mountains of Afghanistan, a place that once again lived up to its ancient name, the graveyard of empires.